All packs lost the king to frenzy, until her hands turned his rage into moonbound clarity. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Hey Quay Lai Voi Nin Vat Chin. Elena Cross stood at the edge of the lunar preserve as the night pulled tight around her like a held breath, the kind that made instruments hum a little louder and shadows feel heavier than they should. The moon here wasn't gentle. It was a disciplined, pale giant that ruled cycles, moods, and memories, its light washing the stone plains in a silver clarity that felt almost surgical. Her wrist monitor ticked steadily, reading normal vitals, ambient pressure stable, temperature hovering at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Nothing remarkable on paper, yet the air carried a tension that statistics couldn't explain. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the packs had scattered, their signals blinking out one by one, not from fear exactly, but from resignation. The king had entered frenzy again, and when that happened, leadership dissolved into distance. Elena had learned that on her first week as a biomech technician assigned to observe non-human neural cycles. She wasn't a soldier or a diplomat. She fixed calibration errors, logged anomalies, and listened more than she spoke. Tonight, listening meant feeling the ground vibrate in a slow, uneven rhythm, like a heartbeat searching for its own pace. She adjusted the gloves at her wrists, thin polymer meant for sensors rather than protection, and took a step forward, boots crunching softly over mineral dust measured in inches rather than miles. The ridge opened to a basin where moonlight pooled, and there he was, King Reeler, towering yet strangely contained, shoulders rising and falling as if he were carrying a weight no crown could balance. His eyes reflected the moon in fractured pieces, not wild, just overwhelmed, as if clarity had slipped sideways. Elena stopped at a respectful distance, counting her breaths the way her old instructor had taught her back on Earth, for seconds in, for seconds out, a simple human rhythm, measured in beats per minute rather than ancient law. The instruments on her glove registered elevated neural oscillation from him, a storm of signals looping without resolution, and she understood then that frenzy wasn't rage, but saturation, too much input without release. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't signal the packs or the orbiting relay. She simply lowered herself to one knee, palms open, letting the moon paint her hands the same color as the stone. The wind brushed past at maybe 10 miles per hour, cool and steady, carrying the scent of mineral rain from a storm that would never quite arrive. Reeler turned his head, slowly, cautiously, not as a threat, but as a question, and in that small motion Elena felt the story shift from distance to presence. She wasn't here to command or correct. She was here to remain. The moon climbed another fraction of an inch in the sky, time measured not by clocks, but by quiet persistence. And as Elena held her position, the basin seemed to wait with her, for the moment when clarity could find its way back. Elena stayed where she was, knee pressed into cold stone, the ground firm enough to feel through the padding of her suit, her breath forming faint clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. She was aware of every small detail because her mind refused to rush, the soft hum of her wrist monitor, the faint vibration underfoot that rose and fell with the king's breathing, the way the moonlight traced clean edges along his silhouette instead of blurring him into something monstrous. She had been trained to observe from behind barriers and data feeds, but this assignment had always been different, closer, quieter, asking her to trust presence over procedure. Elena Cross had grown up in places where silence meant safety, where listening mattered more than talking, and that habit had followed her from a small Midwestern town to orbital stations and finally, to this preserve measured in square miles of stone and sky. Her background was not heroic, just practical. Years of school focused on neural synchronization, human and non-human alike, learning how rhythms aligned and what happened when they did not. She remembered her first briefing about the king, the warnings delivered in careful language, how frenzy cycles were described as unavoidable, how packs withdrew not out of fear, but respect, leaving him alone until clarity returned on its own timetable. Elena had raised a hand back then, asking what the king experienced during those hours, and the room had gone politely quiet because no one really knew. Tonight, she thought she understood a little more, watching the way his shoulders eased by fractions of an inch when the wind shifted, how his attention moved toward her without sharpening. She did not approach yet. Distance was still part of respect, and she measured it carefully, about 20 feet, close enough for sensors to read, far enough that her presence felt like an option rather than an intrusion. Her gloves registered the environment, lunar radiation levels steady, neural interference fluctuating, but her focus stayed on subtler signs, the way his breathing slowed from something jagged into something almost even, the way his hands, large and heavy, unclenched slightly at his sides. Elena remembered her instructor's voice explaining that synchronization often began before contact, that nervous systems noticed each other long before skin did. She adjusted her posture, straightening her back, keeping her shoulders relaxed, letting her own heartbeat settle into a calm 60 beats per minute, a rhythm she could hold for hours if needed. The packs were gone now, their distant signals fully silent, leaving just the basin, the moon, and two figures sharing space. Elena felt no urge to speak because words would have flattened the moment into something smaller than it was. Instead, she focused on staying visible, letting the moonlight outline her clearly, a human shape unarmed and unhidden, anchored to the ground. The king shifted again, turning more fully toward her, and his gaze lingered, not sharp, not lost, just searching. Elena's monitor chimed softly, a notification she dismissed without looking, trusting her senses more than numbers. She knew this was the point where most protocols would advise retreat, but protocols were written for averages, not for singular moments like this. She stayed, hands still open, breath steady, offering nothing except continuity, a simple human constant measured not in power or authority, but in time willingly given. The distance between them closed not by steps, but by permission, the kind that settled into the air when neither side felt the need to defend space anymore. Elena felt it before she measured it, a subtle shift like pressure equalizing, and only then did she move, rising slowly from her knee to her feet, so her height changed without surprise. She took one step forward, then another, each footfall deliberate, counted, no more than a foot at a time until she was within 10 feet of the king. The moonlight brightened the details of his expression, not feral, not distant, but strained, as if clarity were something he remembered but could not quite reach. Elena raised her left hand first, palm open, fingers relaxed. The universal gesture she had learned worked across species because it carried no demand. Her glove sensors lit softly, registering elevated neural noise, but also a new pattern beneath it, a slower wave emerging like a shoreline under retreating water. She held her hand there, not reaching yet, letting the space between them do its own work. The king inhaled, a long breath that filled his chest, and then released with a sound closer to relief than anger, and Elena matched it instinctively, breathing out at the same pace. Her monitor vibrated with a quiet alert, synchronization trending upward, but she did not look, trusting the moment more than confirmation. She remembered a study from her early career, a paper arguing that leadership species often carried the emotional weight of entire social structures, that when isolation was enforced, clarity became harder, not easier. Standing here, she believed it. The king's gaze dropped to her hand, then lifted to her face, and Elena met it steadily, not challenging, not submissive, simply present. She took another small step, now close enough that she could feel the heat of his body against the cold air, the contrast sharp, but not uncomfortable. Slowly, with care that bordered on reverence, she extended her right hand as well, both palms open, framing the space between them rather than filling it. The wind shifted again, tugging at her hair inside her helmet, and the moon climbed higher, its light smoothing the basin into something almost serene. When the king moved, it was not sudden. He lowered himself, not fully kneeling but bringing his center closer to the ground, reducing the difference between them until they shared the same horizon line. Elena felt her throat tighten with something she refused to name, focusing instead on the task she had chosen by staying. She closed the final inches with intention, placing her left hand gently against his forearm, the contact light, measurable. Skin to glove. The sensors flared, data streaming, But beneath it Elena felt the truth of it. The way his muscles softened under her touch. The way his breathing evened further, settling into a rhythm that mirrored her own. She did not speak. She did not smile. She simply stayed, her hands steady, her presence consistent, offering her nervous system as a reference point. Around them, the preserve remained silent, the packs absent, the moon steady, as if the world itself were holding space for this alignment. Elena felt the king's attention settle fully on her now, not as a threat, not as a subject, but as a point of orientation, and she understood that this was the threshold, the moment where frenzy could either reclaim its ground or finally loosen its hold, guided not by force, but by something far rarer, the quiet clarity that came from being met without fear. Elena kept her hand where it was, steady against the king's forearm, long enough for the moment to stop feeling fragile and start feeling real. The sensors in her glove adjusted automatically, compensating for temperature differences, but she barely noticed, because the change she cared about was internal, the way his presence shifted from overwhelming to focused. His breathing settled into a slow, even pattern, roughly 12 breaths per minute, close enough to human resting rhythm that her training manuals would have flagged it as an anomaly. Elena felt a quiet sense of confirmation, not triumph, just understanding, as if a hypothesis had finally stepped out of theory and into lived space. She let her right hand rise as well, moving with deliberate slowness, giving him time to track the motion without alarm. When she placed it lightly against his other arm, the connection completed a simple circuit, human to king, presence to presence, and the effect was immediate in a way no simulation could have predicted. His shoulders lowered another fraction, tension draining in measurable degrees, and his gaze softened, no longer searching but anchored. Elena focused on her breathing, keeping it consistent, because she knew synchronization worked both ways, and any spike in her own heart rate could ripple outward. She remembered her grandmother teaching her how to calm horses back home, how animals responded less to commands than to the quiet confidence of someone who did not intend to leave. Standing here now, she felt that lesson scale up to something larger, something cosmic, without losing its simplicity. The moon climbed higher, its light turning cooler, and the basin took on a clarity that felt almost ceremonial, though Elena knew no ritual had been planned for tonight. The king shifted his weight, settling more fully, bringing his center of gravity closer to hers, not looming, not retreating, simply sharing space. Elena adjusted her stance to match, feet planted shoulder-width apart, knees loose, body language open and stable. Her monitor chimed softly again, displaying synchronization metrics she could review later, but for now she let the data wait. This was not a moment for analysis, but for maintenance, the careful holding of a state that could easily fracture if rushed. She felt the faint vibration of his voice before she heard it, a low resonance that did not form words, more a release of tension than an attempt at communication. Elena responded without thinking, exhaling slowly, allowing the sound to pass through the shared space without interpretation. Around them, the preserve remained still, the absence of the packs no longer heavy but respectful, as if they sensed the shift and chose not to interfere. Elena became acutely aware of time stretching, minutes passing without urgency, each second reinforcing the last. The king's eyes remained on her, clear now, reflecting the moon in a single, unbroken shape, and she understood that clarity was not something she had given him, but something she had made room for. She stayed, hands steady, posture calm, offering no commands, no expectations, just continuity. In that quiet exchange, Elena realized that leadership, across species and worlds, might not always be about strength or dominance, but about the rare willingness to be present when withdrawal felt safer. The moon continued its steady climb, marking the passage of a night that would be remembered not for spectacle, but for the simple, profound act of staying. Time lost its sharp edges as Elena and the king remained connected. The basin held in a quiet equilibrium that felt both fragile and resilient. Elena noticed the subtle changes first, the way his breathing no longer needed her rhythm to stay even, the way his posture held its own balance without drifting back toward tension. Her sensors reflected it seconds later, neural oscillations smoothing into coherent patterns, the spikes dissolving into something readable, almost calm. She eased her left hand away by an inch, then held, watching carefully for any sign of regression. None came. The king remained steady, his attention still on her, but no longer dependent, as if clarity had found its footing and could stand on its own. Elena allowed herself a slow exhale, relief tempered by discipline, because she knew moments like this could shift again without warning. She shifted her weight slightly, testing the space between them, and found it no longer felt charged with risk. The moonlight softened further as the night progressed, its angle changing by degrees that Elena tracked instinctively, years of working in controlled environments making her sensitive to small transitions. The air temperature dipped a few degrees, now closer to 38 Fahrenheit, and she adjusted the thermal regulation in her suit without breaking eye contact. The king followed the movement with mild curiosity rather than alertness, his expression open, grounded. Elena lowered her right hand next, resting it briefly at her side before returning it to a neutral position, palms still visible, still non-threatening. She sensed the presence of the packs before she saw them, faint signals returning at the edge of her awareness, not rushing in, but observing from a respectful distance. Their restraint confirmed what Elena felt, that the crisis had passed its peak. The king shifted again, this time rising slightly, his height increasing, but the motion carried no menace, only a return to his natural bearing. Elena mirrored the adjustment by straightening fully, maintaining their shared horizon, refusing to be dwarfed or defensive. She noticed the way his gaze moved briefly toward the ridge where the packs waited, then back to her, as if acknowledging both worlds he occupied. Elena understood that this balance, between leader and individual, between instinct and awareness, was something he would need to navigate long after she left the preserve. She did not offer advice or instruction, knowing that this clarity was his to claim, not hers to define. The wind picked up gently, carrying the distant scent of mineral rain again, and the basin seemed to breathe with it. Elena checked her monitor at last, a quick glance confirming what she already knew. Synchronization achieved. Frenzy cycle de-escalated without force or isolation. She logged a mental note to record the data later, aware that no report could fully capture what had happened here. The king inclined his head slightly, a gesture that felt less like acknowledgement and more like recognition, and Elena returned it with the same simplicity. She stepped back one pace, then another, reintroducing distance with care, making it clear that her staying had been a choice, and her leaving would be the same. The king did not follow. He remained where he was, grounded, present, his clarity no longer moonbound but self-held. Elena turned toward the ridge, feeling the weight of the night lift from her shoulders, knowing that this moment would resonate beyond measurements and charts. As she walked away, the moon continued its steady path across the sky, marking the end of a frenzy not with spectacle, but with understanding. Elena reached the ridge at a measured pace, her boots finding familiar purchase on the stone as the basin receded behind her, yet she felt the king's presence remain, not as pressure but as a steady point in her awareness. The packs were visible now, silhouettes arranged in respectful arcs, their posture calm, alert, no longer fragmented. She did not address them directly, knowing this was not her role, but she sensed their attention follow her with curiosity that carried no hostility. Her wrist monitor vibrated again, a low-priority notification confirming stability across the preserve, and she muted it with a gentle tap, choosing quiet over confirmation. The moonlight painted the ridge in clean lines, revealing paths she had walked many times before, though none had felt quite like this. Elena paused briefly, turning back just enough to see the king still centered in the basin, his stance settled, his gaze lifted to the moon rather than scanning for threats. The sight grounded her, a reassurance that clarity, once found, could endure without supervision. She resumed walking, each step easing the transition from witness to observer, from participant to keeper of what had been learned. As she moved, her thoughts shifted to implications rather than outcomes, to how presence could be integrated into protocols without stripping it of its humanity. She knew the committees back home would ask for replicable steps, controlled variables, assurances that tonight had not been an exception. Elena considered how she would answer, honestly but carefully, explaining that the method was simple but not easy, that it required time, restraint, and the willingness to remain without controlling. The air cooled further as the night progressed, dropping closer to 35 Fahrenheit, and she adjusted her suit again, the soft hum of thermal regulation a familiar companion. She reached the observation marker at the top of the ridge, a small metal post no taller than her knee, and rested her hand on it for a moment, feeling its chill seep through the glove. From here, the preserve unfolded in wide arcs of silver and shadow, the moon's reflection tracing a path across the stone like a map. Elena activated her recorder at last, speaking quietly, not as a report but as a reflection, describing the sequence of events with precision, noting timings, distances, rhythms, careful to frame her presence as facilitation rather than intervention. She emphasized the importance of voluntary engagement, of allowing the king to lead the return to balance rather than imposing it from outside. When she finished, she closed the recorder without transmitting, deciding the words could wait. She leaned against the ridge, folding her arms loosely, and allowed herself to feel the residual emotion she had set aside earlier, a mix of humility and resolve. Below, the packs began to move, not rushing the basin but reoccupying it gradually, their formation fluid, coordinated, respectful of the space the king had reclaimed. Elena watched as the king acknowledged them with a subtle shift, an economy of motion that spoke to renewed command without display. She understood then that leadership here was not diminished by what had happened, but strengthened, reshaped by the memory of being met rather than avoided. The moon climbed higher still, its light thinning as it reached its apex, and the night settled into a steady calm. Elena checked the time, noting that hours had passed without feeling long, and prepared to return to the station at first light. As she turned away from the ridge, she carried with her not a sense of accomplishment, but a quiet certainty that across worlds and species, clarity could be invited by something profoundly human, the choice to stay present when withdrawal was easier, and to leave only after balance had been restored. Elena did not expect the call before dawn, but when her wrist monitor pulsed with a priority signal, just as the horizon began to pale, she understood without urgency that something had shifted again. The preserve was still stable, readings calm, yet the request came not from the station but from the basin itself. A routed channel authorized only by the king. She paused, standing at the observation deck as the first light spread thinly across the stone, and accepted the transmission. There were no words, only coordinates and a timestamp, a quiet invitation rather than an alarm. Elena adjusted her gear and set out immediately, moving with the same measured pace that had served her through the night, the air now closer to 45 Fahrenheit as the moon yielded to morning. When she reached the basin, the packs were present but parted, their formation open, expectant, and she passed through without challenge, sensing a collective awareness that something new was being asked. The king stood where he had been before, but the quality of the space around him was different, not heavy with tension but charged with intention, as if clarity had opened a door and now required choice to step through. Elena approached until she stood within conversational distance, her posture relaxed, her hands visible but at her sides, ready without presumption. The king inclined his head slightly, then looked past her toward the rising sun, and Elena followed his gaze, understanding that this moment was not about crisis but about consequence. She felt the weight of it settle into her chest, not fear, but responsibility, because clarity carried its own demands. The king turned back to her, his expression steady, and for the first time since she had known him, his attention felt fully present without strain. He raised one hand slowly, not toward her, but toward the space between them, indicating the ground where moonlight had pooled hours earlier. Elena recognized the gesture as an acknowledgement of what had occurred there, not as a claim, but as a memory made visible. She stepped forward one pace, then stopped, allowing him to set the terms of proximity. The packs watched closely now, not with suspicion, but with something like anticipation, as if waiting to see how clarity would translate into action. Elena felt the familiar pull of protocol urging her to document, to define, but she resisted, knowing that some moments shaped policy precisely because they could not be reduced to procedure. The king lowered his hand and spoke at last, his voice low and even, not commanding but deliberate, and though his words were few, their meaning was unmistakable. He was asking her to stay, not as a constant presence, but as a bridge to help translate this experience into something his world could hold without losing it. Elena considered the request carefully, aware of the implications for her role and for the fragile balance she had helped restore. She answered not immediately, but with the same patience she had offered through the night, meeting his gaze, letting the silence affirm her respect. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of choice rather than obligation. She agreed, not to remain indefinitely, but to return when needed, to stand present when cycles tightened and clarity threatened to slip. The king nodded once, accepting the terms without negotiation, and Elena felt a quiet sense of alignment settle between them. The sun climbed higher, warming the stone, dissolving the last traces of moonlight, and the packs shifted subtly, responding to the unspoken signal that leadership had evolved. Elena stepped back, marking the end of the exchange, and as she turned toward the ridge once more, she understood that the most difficult moment was not the frenzy itself, but what followed, the choice to live differently with the memory of being met, and to honor that clarity not as an exception, but as a standard. The change came quietly, not as a disruption, but as a realization that settled into the preserve over the following days, the kind that reshaped habits without announcing itself. Elena returned to the station and filed her reports with careful language, emphasizing stability and adaptive leadership, but she knew the real shift was happening beyond charts, unfolding in how the packs moved, how space was shared, how the basin no longer emptied completely during lunar peaks. When she returned at the next full moon, invited again by coordinates rather than alarm, the air felt different from the start, lighter, purposeful. The king met her at the edge of the basin this time, not centered and isolated, but with the packs nearby, their presence no longer withdrawn, their posture attentive rather than wary. Elena noted the change instinctively, the way leadership now radiated outward instead of collapsing inward, and she felt a quiet respect for the courage it took to alter a tradition older than any written record. The moon rose as before, pale and exacting, but the frenzy did not claim the space. Instead, there was a tightening, a pressure like a held breath, familiar, but manageable. Elena stood where she had before, not touching, not intervening, her role reduced to witness, and she watched as the king closed his eyes briefly, grounding himself with a breath that matched the rhythm he had learned. The packs mirrored him, their movements slowing, synchronizing, and Elena realized then that the clarity he had found was no longer bound to her presence alone. It had become communal, distributed, resilient. The king opened his eyes and looked to her, and in that glance she recognized the twist she had not anticipated, that her greatest contribution had not been staying, but leaving at the right time. He spoke then, his voice carrying across the basin with calm authority, acknowledging the moon not as a trigger but as a guide, a reminder rather than a sentence. Elena listened, understanding enough to feel the weight of it, even as the specifics remained his to define. She sensed the packs absorb the shift, their attention steady, their trust evident not in submission but in alignment. The night unfolded without incident, hours passing marked only by the moon's slow arc and the steady presence of bodies sharing space without fear. Elena felt something ease inside her, a release of responsibility she had carried since that first night, and she understood that this was the true measure of success, not dependence, but independence shaped by connection. As dawn approached, the king approached her, stopping at a respectful distance, and inclined his head in a gesture that carried gratitude without debt. Elena returned it, her expression warm but restrained, aware that the moment belonged to the world they shared, not to her alone. When she turned to leave, the packs did not part for her. They simply made space, fluid and natural, as if she had always been part of the landscape. From the ridge, Elena looked back one last time, watching the basin hold its shape under the fading moon, and she felt the moral echo of the experience settle into something clear and enduring. In a universe that often measured strength by domination, she had witnessed leadership transformed by presence, rage softened by being seen, and clarity reclaimed not through force, but through the quiet courage to stay, and then to step away. Elena left the preserve on a morning washed clean by pale sunlight, the stones still cool underfoot, the air steady and quiet in a way that felt earned rather than imposed. From the ridge, she paused once more, not out of habit but recognition, sensing how the basin below held its shape without tension, how movement flowed instead of fractured. The king stood among his packs, not elevated, not withdrawn, simply present, his posture balanced, his attention shared. He did not look to her this time, and Elena felt no need for acknowledgement, understanding that the absence of attention was itself a sign of success. She turned toward the station path, boots marking a rhythm she had walked many times before, and began the return with a lighter step than she remembered. At the station, life resumed its familiar cadence, reports reviewed, schedules adjusted, committees convened to discuss the implications of what could not be fully quantified. Elena participated when asked, offering clarity without embellishment, insisting on restraint where others sought replication, reminding them that presence could not be automated without losing its essence. Weeks passed, then months, each lunar cycle confirming what the first had promised, stability maintained, leadership adaptive, the frenzy reduced from a defining threat to a managed passage. Elena returned less frequently, then only when invited, and eventually not at all, trusting the systems she had helped shape to hold without her. On her final visit, brief and unannounced, she stood once more at the ridge, observing without intervening, noting how the packs gathered and dispersed with ease, how the king moved among them with a calm authority that no longer required isolation. The moon rose, pale and exact, and passed without incident, its light tracing familiar paths across the stone, now free of the old charge. Elena felt the quiet satisfaction of work completed, not finished, but released. She recorded one last private note, not for archives or review, but for herself, reflecting on how humanity's greatest contribution to the galaxy might not be its technology or reach, but its capacity to remain with another being without trying to fix, command, or own the outcome. She wrote of hands offered without force, of silence held without fear, of leadership reclaimed through being seen rather than resisted. When she closed the recorder, she did not transmit it, choosing instead to carry the lesson forward in practice rather than policy. As she departed the preserve for the final time, the sun climbed behind her, warming the stone, dissolving the last traces of moonlight into ordinary day. Somewhere behind her, the king lifted his gaze briefly, not searching, not calling, simply aware, and then returned his attention to his world, complete without her presence. Elena continued on, a single human figure moving back toward her own kind, carrying no trophy, no title, only a truth she would share when asked and live whether asked or not. In a galaxy that often measured worth by dominance and control, she had witnessed something quieter and far more enduring, that clarity could be born from compassion, that strength could coexist with gentleness, and that sometimes the most powerful act was not to lead or to fight, but to stay, to see, and then to let go.